Okay, welcome to the Captains Table. This name comes from it's my last name. My name is Steve Captain, and it also comes from the idea of the captain of a ship when he would invite guests to the captain's table for dinner, and they would just have kind of some free-form discussion. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. I have with me Imam Junaid Asi and Pastor Harvey Turner, and I want them to kind of introduce themselves. So if you guys, maybe beginning with Imam Junaid, if you could tell us a little bit about your faith community and your role within that community, and then we'll turn it over to Pastor Harvey.
Sounds good. Thanks for having me, Steve. And my name is Junaid Asi. I serve as an imam, khatib or religious director, speaker in the Southern California region, serving mainly locally the Altadena community, Masjid Taqwa, up on Lake Avenue. Also serving several other communities, including the Islamic Center of Burbank, the Islamic Center of St. Gabriel Valley, a couple of colleges and universities with student groups. My primary role is to deliver the sermons, also working with youth, mainly high school age youth, as well as leading prayer and offering other spiritual or religious leader services to the Muslim community here in Southern California.
That's awesome. I totally forgot that you worked with high school. I got to go check that out sometime. I work with young people, work with youth, and did some doctoral research on identity confusion and cultural clashing between the East and the West. It'd just be kind of fun to check out their world and see where they're at with that. But that's not what this podcast is about. So I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Harvey and let him share a little bit about himself and his community of faith.
Yeah, my name is Harvey Turner. I'm the pastor of All Souls Church in Burbank, California. And my primary role within our church community is preaching the Bible, and what we call the administration of the sacraments, baptism and communion, and then also the shepherding of the people in the community in their spiritual life. So that's my primary role here.
Awesome. And I have sat under both these guys teaching. They're both great communicators and have great things to say. So that's my little plug there for both of them. In today's episode, I want to talk about the community of faith and what's been happening, what has happened with COVID-19 and now entering kind of a post-COVID era, and the ways in which pain kind of stimulate faith, so to speak. I want to begin with this famous quote from C.S. Lewis just to kind of stimulate our thinking, get the conversation going. And he says this, he says, "Pain insists on being attended to. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our consciences, but shouts in our pain. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." And I like that last line. It is his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And I'm curious as to what you guys think about that quote. So, Imam Junaid, what do you think?
Beautifully put. I think like the last part definitely resonates with our faith community as Muslims, where, I think when life is going good, everything is smooth, you sometimes tend to forget about God and even thank God, right? So when you are going through some hard times, troubling times, some hardship, it's often then when Muslims and probably most human beings would turn to God for higher calling, and they just kind of like crying out for help, wanting somebody to hear them out, see that they're in pain and suffering, and they want to get out of that situation. So I think it's a beautiful quote, and I can definitely relate for the Muslim community.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of reminds me of the old adage, there are no atheists in foxholes, right?
Yeah.
Because of the pain. So, Pastor Harvey, what do you think?
Yeah, I would agree. I've definitely I've done pastoral ministry for 23, 24 years, and I've seen that people grow when they need to. And a lot of times it's suffering that brings that need to the surface. Other things do as well, but a lot of times people are fine with going through the motions until there's a real pain or something that drives them to the end. One of my favorite quotes is from a pastor on the East Coast. He says, God's office is at the end of your rope. So that's where we meet God, is when we're at the end of ourselves. And oftentimes we're not ready to humble ourselves until we're at the end of ourselves. And then, for the Christian faith also, suffering is right there at the center with the cross of Christ. That the Christian story is that God became human to enter the suffering of this world and not just leave us on our own in our suffering, but to take it on, in a sense. And so not only do I see that to be true in people's life, that they take God a little more seriously when suffering comes, when they have that deep need, but it's also the very center of the Christian faith. Our symbol is the cross, the suffering of God. He enters our suffering. So, yeah.
Okay, so you've found that the symbol of the cross, if I'm wording this correctly, when people truly understand what it represents, it can bring comfort.
Yes, because from the Christian perspective is that God came and suffered with us.
Okay.
And that we're not alone, that he does understand.
Okay, now I wonder, in the Islamic faith, are there symbols that the people of faith will look to or grab onto for comfort during times of suffering?
Not so much symbols, Steve, but we turn more towards, actually, it's from one of the verses of the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, where God tells us that through times of pain and suffering, to turn towards prayer and patience, to the two P's, I call them sometimes, where when you're going through some hard times, then God is telling us that that's the time to turn to prayer and to turn to patience. And it's interesting that it's both together, mentioned together as a combination, which I think really shows when you look at like even the human psychology, like you apply for a job, or you do something there, you expect this immediate gratification, but God is reminding you to be patient because you did the deed, right? You prayed to God, but now you have to remain patient for your prayers to be answered. So and so instead of symbol, like prayer is the first thing, and then secondary, just turning towards our holy book for answers. What did God tell us in the Quran, including talking about like how previous nations went through hardships and how they dealt with it. And our main spiritual leader is Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was sent to us as an example of how to live our life on earth. And he went through a lot of hard times too. So those are kind of like our, not like symbols as in like tangible symbols, but more of like, references or guides, if you will.
Yeah, that's cool. I'm going to remember that, actually, the two P's.
Yes,
two
I thought that
P's
was
in
good.
A pod. Yeah.
That might make it into a sermon of mine one day.
It's a great takeaway. Well, it's interesting as I've been preparing for this and looking at communities of faith in the United States in the 20th century, when crisis has hit us from World War II, even the Vietnam War, and all the way up to 9/11, different things that happened have caused people, at least in the Christian community, to return to church, and church attendance has grown, and it's stayed that way. But ironically, when COVID-19 hit, churches emptied, and it kind of had to because of the disease and the virus and everything else. But what I have seen hasn't been true for all congregations necessarily, but the decline has remained.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite. It's a crisis that emptied the church. So before I turn to Pastor Harvey about Christian communities, I'm wondering, what was the dynamic in Islamic communities? What happened when COVID-19 hit, and what is continuing to happen?
Sure, Steve. So one thing to keep in mind from the Islamic faith is that on Fridays, as you came by our mosque in Al Tadina, you saw that you had a good attendance. And for every Muslim adult male, they are required to come and pray in person in the mosque on Fridays.
Okay.
And there's other prayers. We have 5 prayers a day spread throughout the day from morning until nighttime. But if you couldn't make it, it's not the end of the world, but the Friday afternoon one you can't miss. If you're a man, you're an adult, you have to show up. So you can imagine when the doors were shut due to COVID, right, with the restrictions, the local laws and regulations, trying to keep everybody, in the world safe. It hit us really hard because now this requirement of being in person, congregating and praying in person was basically stopped. And that affected the Muslim community very drastically. It's something that I don't think anyone from even our parents and grandparents' generation had ever faced before. And we were just not ready for it. And, because the pandemic hit so unexpectedly and there was no prep work, we, of course, followed every community I've worked with, every mosque and Islamic center I've worked with, closed their doors, right? And they have different timelines of when they reopen with the COVID changes. Burbank, since we are located in Burbank and talking through Burbank, did have a special permissions letter from, I forget, it was the police or the city hall, but for 10 people only. And it's probably because they had a huge area where it was easy to spread out, it's a 6 feet mandate and so on. And they were told that, they could be audited, like the police officer can come and check, make sure you're following rules. And the rest of the community, it hurt very deeply to see that people wanted to come and pray, but they couldn't. So the rest of the community was told, look, we're going to do our sermons online, which I'm sure Pastor Harvey will share too, like in the Christian faith, as well as probably many other faiths had to turn to this online version of broadcasting live and so on. But for us, the part about not just the sermon, but the praying together part gets affected because we're not allowed to pray over a live broadcast. It has to be physically present.
Wow.
So if you can imagine, right, the once a week mandatory prayer in the mosque, at least for the men, that gets affected this way, everyone's scrambling around, scratching their heads. What do you do? Turning to the scholars, and the scholars had to issue, they call it a fatwa, like a religious ruling, but it's more of a clarification from even the Quran's teaching, God's words, and the Prophet's teaching that your health and safety comes first, as well as of those around you. So for that matter, most of the people were quoting a saying from the Prophet Muhammad regarding a mention of a plague that hit their city. And he told everyone to stay home, right? And he said, if the plague hit your city, you are not allowed to leave. So most people interpreted the pandemic kind of similar to the plague of, okay, just stay in your houses, right? Follow the rules. Don't get anyone else sick. So even for the online world, I will share with you that many people were not ready. They didn't have the resources. Some mosques don't even have an internet connection. They're very old school. So it was definitely difficult. But over time, as some mosques that had better resources were able to go online and see how they can go on either Facebook Live or YouTube or different avenues that are available, they started sharing with other communities. And I've heard of stories of many interfaith work of not just with the Muslims, but the Catholic Church, some synagogues, and other religious communities sharing these tips as to how we can bring people back to connecting with God or connecting to their religious community, and not just thinking, hey, in the pandemic, that's it, we're completely isolated, right? We're quarantined even from God. So that's kind of like our struggle in a nutshell.
Wow, that's incredible. That's very fascinating to me. And I wonder, it raises a lot of questions. But here's the question that I'll ask: now that men can return to the mosque and they can pray, do you see a greater zeal, for lack of a better word, or appreciation? Like, yes, now we can come together publicly. We're not being held back from that. What are you seeing happening?
Yeah, I was going to save that for a little bit later of a story, a funny story that, even though the doors are open now, some people actually became lazy, sorry to say. But they're like, well, can't we still just do things online? Do we really need to drive up there and meet in person? And it's not because of COVID fears, but it's just like the convenience that was provided. So the zeal is back for those that really missed it and really wanted to come, those that want to connect with God, not only in bad times or hard times, but in good times as well, showing gratitude. There was, I would say, a handful of people that rather just still stay at home and kind of lost touch with God, right? And just religion altogether. I don't blame the pandemic. I kind of feel like as a religious leader, it kind of also shows that, maybe they didn't care about God so much, and what I feel responsible for is like, what can I do to reach out to those individuals? What can I do to kind of like motivate them and inspire them and let them know that, it's safe to come back, right? We're following all the rules and regulations, but two, you want to come back and connect, right? You need it, like, you need that for your spiritual healing and so on as well.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I know when the church kind of opened its doors again, it was tough. For lack of a better term, there was an inertia to overcome just to get out the door. It was very convenient, but it's antithetical. I know that's a big word. Antithetical to community, right? Mm-hmm. It's just individuals doing their thing. There's no community that way. So obviously we got to get over that hurdle.
Definitely.
So Pastor Harvey, what's been the experience in the Christian community from your perspective?
Yeah, I think so. Right away when everything had to go online and we couldn't gather, I remember it happened pretty quickly because there was one Sunday where we were like, hey, this could happen. Hey, let's not do handshakes today, as part of our normal greeting time. And let's just fist bump or something. Yeah. And it was literally the next week that they were like, okay, no gatherings of any kind. And, they had certain restrictions. And so we did go online and, it sounds like in Islam, the embodied part of prayer and faith is very important. Well, the same is true in Christianity. The embodied part, it's absolutely crucial. And so for a period of time, we were not able to be an embodied community. And I think at first there was, because of what we just talked about with suffering, there was a unbelievable interest in I remember like the sermons that I was posting on Facebook and the other places online were getting so many hits. And because people were scared and I was preaching on those themes. But then as the pandemic continued to go, you saw the numbers start to drop and on who was watching and who was involved. And in the same way, it sounds like some people were not as serious about God and in the community where what's his name?
Oh, Imam Junaid.
Junaid. Yeah, I didn't want to say it wrong. In the same way, you definitely saw that there were people that were not as committed to the faith once we started gathering again. So I think in a way, there was like a sifting that happened in Christian churches that there was a lot of cultural benefit sometimes for people that like to go to church or have gone to church, and they got out of that normal rhythm of life. And really the people that returned and stuck with it were the people that really believed, and were really there, and they were there for the spiritual reasons, not other reasons. So every church that I know of dropped, from pre-pandemic to post-pandemic, their numbers are around 50%. Almost every church I know of. The only churches I knew that grew during that period of time were the ones that just bucked everything the government said and gathered anyway. And that was more of a political persuasion in some of those churches, so basically the churches that wanted to take the political fight to the government, they grew by a lot of people that felt that way as well. But what you had happening in those churches is a lot of disgruntled people from other churches that didn't like how their church was handling the pandemic going to that church. So I wonder how things are going for those churches now, because they got a lot of disgruntled people.
Right.
But yeah, our church, not only did we face the dynamics of the pandemic, but also not seeing each other, not being in the same spaces together, kind of the worst of people started to come out a little bit. And so we had a sifting in that way as well. So for us, before the pandemic, our congregation was, somewhere between 150 and 200 people. Post-pandemic, when we restarted with 20 people.
Right. I remember. Wow.
And we're looking at more like 70 now, but there is a distinct difference pre and post-pandemic. And I think that what the pandemic did is it sifted the people that really believed and had faith and wanted to be part of the church stuck with it, and the people that just kind of got out of the habit, and it was, maybe they'll make their way back at some point, but that's what we saw.
It's interesting. This came to my mind, and I'll share this, and then we'll take a quick break. But when the pandemic came, physically the masks came on, spiritually the masks came off, right?
Yeah,
and
that's very true.
We saw what happened in our faith communities. Those that really believed kept coming, and to those who don't anymore, or got kind of lazy or whatever. So it sounds like you guys have that in common.
Yeah.
Well, let's take a short break, and then when we come back, I just want to hear from you guys about what motivates people now, and how do we motivate people post-pandemic for faith. So we'll be back in a moment. Okay, welcome back to the Captain's Table. We are discussing pandemic, pain, and faith communities with Imam Junaid Asi and Pastor Harvey Turner. So welcome back, guys. I want to open up this segment just by asking you guys, as spiritual leaders post-pandemic, what are some creative ways that to stimulate faith, bring people back we have lost, but also to build on the genuine faith that we see in our communities? And I think this time I'll begin with Pastor Harvey Turner.
Yeah, so I think that the benefit of everything that happened, even though it was rough, is that the people that did come back really wanted to be here. And then you also started to see people over time trickle back in. At first there were people that still weren't comfortable because of the pandemic reasons. So you start to see people kind of trickle back in and slowly. And I think that just as people go through life, they start to remember, that's why I prayed. That's why I went to church. And they start to, so I think that my hope is that we're seeing a little bit of that happening right now. And then also, with all the other things going on in our world, people have a lot of questions. And so I think what we can do is be there in the midst of their questions, in the midst of their suffering, and instead of trying to motivate with guilt or shame, just be a place of open arms. We named our church All Souls Church specifically for that reason, to say all souls are welcome here. And I think that's important to have that kind of a posture post-pandemic, and then really just invest in and build in the people that are here post-pandemic, and because it's very easy as a leader that you lead. Your ego can get attached to the number of people that are coming to your thing, and really what it did also for pastors is go, okay, why am I really in this? It's probably spiritual leaders across the world. Why am I doing this? Why am I really in this? Because the ego reasons, at least for a little time there, went away. And now it's just like an act of service and love. And the strategy that basically, because I had no other choice, was to really just invest in the people that are here post-pandemic and make it a place for them to be strengthened spiritually, and also through that create more space for people that have not yet come yet, and they come into a healthy spiritual community.
Interesting. It sounds like the pandemic has served to purify some things, motives in the people we're serving, but motives in us as well as spiritual leaders. That's good, I believe. How do you respond to that, Imam Junaid? What are your thoughts on this?
It's definitely a challenge. I don't think anyone can deny that, it's a walk in the park. It's definitely challenging. And just like Pastor Harvey said, it kind of makes us question ourselves too about our motivation, our intentions, and our goals, for ourselves and to our communities. But in terms of actually trying to motivate them and try to increase, the number of people showing up again, I believe it's also a balance. Islam talks a lot about balance. It's not just scaring people and, but also trying to kind of show the merciful side of God. And one creative way I've thought about trying to get people back in is to kind of focus on the fact that as the pandemic is going away, right? I don't know. I don't know if the official word is it's completely gone yet, but as things are getting better, our doors are opening up, or things are going back to normal, and I put normal in air quotes. I would say that in itself is a mercy for everyone. Right? If you look at all the people that suffered through the pandemic, all the lives that were lost, all the people that perhaps got sick, or even that got the COVID and, got better, they know that it wasn't easy. So I think sometimes, just like we started this conversation about the pain and so on, we tend to forget that it's God's mercy that when you're better, or the pandemic is getting better, life is getting back to normal, that we still need to be grateful to God. So in Islam, we believe very strongly about, showing our gratitude to God. And one of the best ways to do that is through our prayer, right? Praying to God and acknowledging it. In fact, the Prophet, Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught also that if you do not thank mankind, you don't thank God, right? We're also supposed to be grateful to other human beings. In the pandemic, we saw so many acts of kindness throughout the world, right? And we cannot take that for granted. I think, trying to find that balance between no longer just like scaring people about like, if you don't do such and such thing, like God will be upset, God will be displeased, right? But also show like, but you know what, if you start showing up again, God is going to be so pleased. Imagine what other type of mercies may be bestowed upon you. And I think lastly, I would sum it up with a reminder to myself and my community, and perhaps all communities can take some lesson from this. It is a beautiful verse from the Quran in chapter 67, verse 2, where God says, He is the one who created death and life in order to test which of you is best in deeds. And He is the Almighty and all-forgiving. So it kind of reminds us in this verse about the purpose of life from the Islamic perspective, about, trying to strive to do good, to do better in deeds. And that could include, deeds towards other human beings and, animals, and acts of kindness to ourselves. And then I love how the verse ends with the forgiveness. Like maybe we were harsh on ourselves in the pandemic. Everyone, went through their ups and downs, or roller coasters, as I call them sometimes. And sometimes we need to remember that, well, God is, all forgiving. So, really trying to find that balance between these concepts and trying to make people realize that don't take for granted what you have. You're healthy now, the doors are opening up, right? The church is open, the mosque is open, right? Life is getting back to normal. Let's be grateful, right? So I think that's one of the big motivations I'm trying to work on with our community still.
Yeah, I like what you said about watching our fellow human beings and looking for the kindness that they show. Too many times, I'm talking about me, whether it's in traffic and someone cuts me off, or I'm in the grocery store and somebody does something, I am too quick to see what I am not thankful for in others and what I don't like. And I love what you said, that to recognize those things, and when we are thankful for that, we're really thanking God. It's a recognition that all good things come from God. That in our humanity, we're going to disappoint. We're not going to do well. And when we do see good, oh, thank you, because that is from God. That is from God.
Yeah.
And when the pandemic kind of revealed the contents of our heart, I'm going to get personal to prime the pump so you guys can be a little bit personal. I saw good and I saw bad. I saw some bad things. When the pandemic hit, when I was in Malaysia, holed up with my family in a tiny place, and it wasn't all good what we saw in each other. We got on each other's nerves. There was nowhere to go. They were very strict. We couldn't go anywhere. And in the middle of all this, my son, who was 8 at the time, is very active, like boys can be. And he's jumping around. I don't know why he decided to do this. It's not like he decided to do this. He fell on the tile and he busted out his 2 front teeth.
Oh, man.
Oh, no.
Adult teeth, okay?
Oh, no.
Adult teeth. And so I hear this screaming. I go out there. I see my wife cradling him, and I see these chunks I'm like, is that bone? What is that? On the floor. He's crying. He looks at me. I see blood. You'd think this well of compassion would come up within me, and I'm just annoyed. And my first thought, I am ashamed to say this, my first thought is, God, how could you allow this to happen? Right? That is not my brightest moment in terms of painful circumstances revealing what's in my heart. But there is a resilience, right? Picking myself back up and then acknowledging so many things to be thankful for. We had a car. The dental office was open. I was able to get him there very quickly because the streets were cleared, no traffic, and they helped him out, and they did reconstruction. Everything was fine. You can't even tell. So all good things, and we came back around. We prayed together as a family and thanked God for everything positive that was happening. So that's my personal story from the pandemic, of some good and some bad, mostly bad now that I think about it. But there were good things. I can think of a student of mine in Malaysia. He rose to the occasion in his village, and he was able to provide some online platforms for students at the church. And everyone, Muslims, indigenous people, and everyone came to the church so they could connect to the students to keep their homework going, to keep school going, and everything else. And he took people around and kind of bent the rules, didn't really break them, bent the rules, got food, supplies out to everyone, and that's a brighter, I share that because that's a brighter moment than what I was able to demonstrate during the pandemic. But for you guys as faith leaders, I'm wondering, what did the pandemic reveal for you guys as spiritual leaders? What were some of the challenges that kind of came up for serving your people? And how did you yourself rise to the occasion, so to speak? So the challenges and the rise to faith, I guess. So Imam Junaid, I'll go with you.
Okay. Definitely, I think the pandemic, like Pastor Harvey was saying, the sifting, I like that word, sifting. I was calling it filtering, but sifting is good too. Right? But I think every human being kind of gets to sift and see their good and bad. Like it becomes apparent, kind of like the story your personal story you mentioned, Steve. And I think I noticed something. I'll share a story of more personal, but something I heard in the community and many of the communities where I was delivering sermons online in the pandemic was a common complaint about being bored, being stuck and bored at home. And I think I'm opening a can of worms with this topic already. But first, I heard my kids say that, and I talked to them about why do they think they're bored. And they said, well, because we can't go out, everything is closed, the mall is closed, this is closed, that's closed. And I thought, but how about all the things that are not closed, right? We can still go to a park, right? There's no restrictions on going to a park. We can go walk on the beach. We can go drive up the mountains. We can still go bike around. So, right? So I think the focus became on the negative or the glass being half empty and not the half full. And so soon after hearing this from my children, I was hearing this from our communities. Brother, we're bored. Mom, what do we do? Life is boring. And one of my first sermons during the pandemic for one of the community, it's actually in Santa Clarita area, I mainly did it on the topic of not seeing that we're bored, but trying to look at the glass as half full and seeing all the things that we have. And one thing I challenged us with was to look into our lives and really ask ourselves, if we're at home and we're, isolating, following the mandates and so on, initially, like when it was 2 weeks and everyone thought after 2 weeks, that's it, we're going to go back outside, right? Even if it was only 2 weeks and we are not being grateful for what we have at home, we're complaining that we don't want to stay at home or deal with the people at home. I think it requires us to dig deeper into ourselves and see, well, what's the real problem? Like, what are we really complaining about? And we have a roof over our head, we have clothes, we have food, right? And then to my children, I talk to them about things like, oh, we have games to play, we have board games, we have books to read. So many other things we can do as a family that, we can definitely focus on and have positive memories, still make this an enjoyable experience. So why not do that rather than focus on what we can't do? And so, it reminded me of, since you mentioned Malaysia, it reminded me of actually a college student from Malaysia that I went to college with who would often say that, in Islam, alcohol is forbidden, but we shouldn't complain about the not being able to drink alcohol because there's so many other delicious drinks out there that we can drink. And I will never forget this. I think you just said it very innocently, but it was very wise to think now, especially in the pandemic, for all the things that every single one of us is blessed with. And if we try to appreciate those things rather than focus on what we don't have. So the challenge, for the most part, I think personally, I was okay. I didn't mind. I know that maybe because, I have that spiritual understanding too, but I know that there's a blessing in everything, right? Islam actually teaches that even in something that may appear to be bad, right? It's actually teaching from the Quran that there may be good in you, but you don't know, right? And sometimes God may tell you to do something that you may think is bad or you don't want to do, but there's goodness. And so we can't just go for the appearance, the outer appearance, right? God has a reason for everything, and we have to trust God. So for the communities, the challenge was, really stop talking and complaining about like the board, we're stuck at home, and trying to start thinking about what can we do at home? If it's so horrible for us to stay stuck with our family, right, then we need to look into ourselves, like Pastor Harvey said, like the name of the church, All Souls. I would say it's more like to look into our soul and ask ourselves, right, really we can't even get along with our family members? And why is that, right? So we need to work on our relationships with other human beings too. And Islam is very, very big on the concept of two type of rights. One is God's rights, but the other is human rights, right? And it's all humans. Doesn't have to be the same faith. Where God will ask, God can forgive you, but if you wronged or oppressed a human being, unless and until that human being forgives you, God will not forgive you. So it's extremely important for us to be just as mindful and cognizant of our human relationships with each other, starting with those closest to us, our families and so on. So I thought of more of like, activities, games or other activities that brings, the family together, and recommend similar things to our communities. I know people came up with a lot of like game shows, like an online Jeopardy or something you can play together where you might be learning something, make it fun. So that's kind of like, what the journey has been or the challenge has been. But I think overall, personally, I don't feel that I felt too, suppressed by the pandemic. It was more of like rolling up your sleeves further and what can I do for my family and my community? And it turned out okay. Looking back, I'm very grateful. It turned out okay.
Yeah, good. Sounds like the theme again is being grateful and being thankful and choosing to focus on what God is doing around you instead of what you don't have and what is not happening. So let's take another short break, and then I'll give Pastor Harvey a chance to respond as well. All right. We'll see you all very soon. Okay, welcome back to the Captain's Table. And we left in the middle of the question, as spiritual leaders, how did we cope with the pandemic, revealing the contents of our hearts, both the good and the bad? How do we respond? And I guess how the spiritual resources that we tap into helped us deal with those things. So, Pastor Harvey, please respond to that.
Yeah, in a similar way, I felt like even though there were some challenges with being locked in the house with the family, there was also a connection that we made that was pretty sweet. Especially my daughters, right now they're 14 and 16. But, so a couple of years ago, they're teenagers, and it's really hard to connect with teenagers. And that time period allowed us to it forced us to all connect, and it was great. I feel like in some ways it was a huge blessing. Now, I would also say that there were times where, I was pushed to my limits, and other people in the family were too. But for the most part, I think it was harder on the church than it was on our family. I think for our family, actually some good things ended up coming out of it. And I think another thing that was good that came out of it is not just for our family and me, but, in the United States, we live such hectic, crazy lifestyles, running, pushing, people working 70, 80 hours a week. And, it's kind of in a way when we fall into that pattern of life, we're not built to just keep pushing. God created us, on the seventh day in the scripture, in the Christian scripture, God rests, and God created us to rest. And what the pandemic forced us to do is not to be overproductive, but instead step back and rest. And when you rest, things come to the surface that are good and bad. You become aware of some things in you that you're not so proud of. When you rest, you also become more aware of things about God, So one thing that I teach when I teach about rest is, the Christian concept of repentance is to change your mind, which leads to a change of heart. But until you one thing that I've learned through rest is that until you rest, you can only repent from the edges of your soul, because you can't really get in tune with what's going on in your soul until you slow down. And what the pandemic did for me, and I think my family, and I know others as well, is it forced me to slow down. It forced me to take some inventory. It forced me to go to some places in my soul that I might not have gone if I, was in the rat race. And I think that's also was true for my family. And in society, you actually see it as well. So many people that were killing themselves in these low-paying jobs, just pushing and pushing and pushing. After the pandemic, they're like, I don't want to live like that anymore. And I think that is a mercy.
Yeah.
to go, I don't have to live in this crazy, frenetic way that everybody in the United States is living, especially from a Christian perspective that, part of the commandments of God is to, out of the 10 commandments, there's one that God's like, hey, take a day off. And that's the one that Americans just can't do. Like we're like, hey, that's a pretty good one. Out of all the commandments, take a day off. We're like, no, sorry, Lord, can't do that. So I think what the pandemic did is it forced a lot of people to slow down a bit and take some inventory about what's really important in life. And I know for me, that definitely
makes me wonder if God in His mercy was forcing us to catch up on those days off.
Yeah,
Just
that's right.
all at once.
That's right. Yeah.
Force us to rest. Good stuff. Yeah, that's a huge takeaway, that when we're so busy, we repent at the edge of our souls. I really like that. I'm going to remember that one, and it's important to slow down and really not rely on a pandemic to force us to take inventory of the things that are happening. It's one thing to repent of kind of getting irritated at the guy that cuts us off. It's another thing to dig deep down to the motivations that believe I'm superior to that guy on the freeway, and how dare he cut me off. So maybe that's too deep for this podcast. I don't know. Let's move on to the next thing. We still got some time. So I guess my question would be for you guys, post-pandemic, with everything that has happened, why do you do what you do? That's part of the question. And then the other part of the question is, as you guys move forward as spiritual leaders, what's the best way to represent faith? And what lessons do you hope your community will learn, and how will they represent faith? If my question is making sense, I hope. So if you guys could respond to that, starting with Imam Junaid, if you could tell us your thoughts.
Okay, that's a bit of mouthful. So so basically, how do we move forward from now, right?
Yeah, and represent for you, representing the Islamic faith.
Sure. So you asked also about why we do what we do, and I think one thing I didn't share in the introduction is that I actually do this on a volunteer basis. I actually do have a full-time job, and I also work part-time as a professor for actually Christian University of Redlands. So for me, this has always been a volunteer thing, but it's because I have that drive in me to know that I need to give back, and I want to be more well-rounded, with education and understanding the world. Right. And when I work with the youth, trying to understand what they go through, I'd like to take other trainings, like if you haven't picked up from some of my suggestions, not just from the spiritual side, but I'm a big advocate on mental health. I have some certifications on mental health training for religious leaders. So I feel like, we have this one chance in this life, this world, to not just work on ourselves, but we are put now with about 7 billion plus people on earth. There's a reason that God put us with other human beings. God is fully capable of giving each and every one of us our own planet or our own solar system. But, we can't forget the other human beings. So I strongly believe in giving back to the community. And I don't mean just the Islamic or Muslim community. Any sort of volunteering. I like to do a lot of volunteer work in relief and so on as well. And I believe as a human being, we owe it to other human beings, where if God has blessed us with more knowledge, experience, or whatever the blessing is that we should share with others. That's one way I like to show the gratitude, the appreciation for what I have, is to give back. And that's actually supposed to be very healthy for us, mentally and so on. And I also feel that sense of responsibility. I've started, in this volunteer work of being an imam, leading prayers and sermons and so on in my late teenage years, and was once called the youngest imam of Los Angeles County area. So I'll never forget that, but it actually initially scared me and gave me that sense of responsibility that I need to learn more. Like if I'm going to do this, I'm helping out, I need to do things the right way. So what is the right way? Let me go learn more, right? And I pursued, I studied informally, I finished my bachelor's. I'm still working on my master's in Islamic studies currently. So I feel like moving forward, I take what God has blessed me with and see how I can use that to inspire other human beings. I love to talk to the young folks and kind of show them that, look, if I could do this with 2 kids and, so 2 jobs, well, one being part-time or seasonal, but, and still being able to volunteer and keep God first, then so can you, right? Maybe you're not at the same level, but you can do it too, right? And I'm grateful to know that a lot of young people actually, when they try to talk to me and understand my life, they do feel inspired that, well, okay, maybe we can't be just like you, but we could do some of it. Yeah, at least once a week we can show up. Okay, maybe once a weekend I can come and volunteer, right? And I believe that that's something that, as a religious leader, we should try to do is to connect with our community, really feel for what they're going through, have that empathy, really understand their pain as well, understand their challenges, because I think it's very difficult, even preparing those sermons and so on. I know you came to attend some, and it's not just a speech, right? It's not just the art of just giving a speech, but being, so as I shared, I go to the different mosques and Islamic centers, but I try to understand each community. What are their challenges? What are they doing? What is the dynamics? What is the geographics? What are some of their challenges? So I can try to deliver sermons that will be most beneficial to that community. And keeping that in mind, I prepare my sermons, not just the topic, but examples, and trying to carefully select verses from the Quran that will be inspiring, and sayings of our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that can be inspiring, so that people can not just feel inspired and motivated, but also see that, hey, we're not the first ones to go through hard times. Others have gone through it as well. And what did they learn? Right. So moving forward, I think, for the Altadena community that you stopped by, they were never able to open up their doors during the pandemic. They're still behind from a lot of other communities. And just in about, actually starting next week, our month of fasting, Ramadan, is starting. And they're still struggling with getting the attendance back. And they told me they're going to have somebody to help them out for the month, so I can go ahead and help out those relief organizations. But they just contacted me about 2 weeks ago saying that, sorry, our plan canceled, or the person's no longer going to be available to help us. Can you please come and help us, right? And I said, absolutely. It's my local community. They deserve my help most. And the biggest, asset is that I know the community, right? So knowing the community, I think, is the biggest, asset or gift for us as a spiritual leader to know, right? And I'm sure Pastor Harvey can relate as well. Like when we talk to our communities, right? Even when the sermon's done and they're on their way out, to know how everyone is doing, not just the religious side, but other things too. Hey, who just had a baby? Who just got married? Who just got a new job? Show them that you're part of the community. And I think that's what keeps us together. And that human aspect sometimes, that we may overlook, if we can also show that we care as a human being as well, hopefully brings them back to, the church, the mosque, and so on, and be able to connect back to God and realize that, look, we're not just here they're giving a sermon, kind of like lecturing them, but we do care about our communities. We really do. And that's like, for me, I think that's the big takeaway, to show our communities that we're there for them. They can reach out to us whenever they want. And I get this all the time. I get calls in the middle of the night, sometimes on the weekend. And that's what we're there for. We're there for them, and we owe it to them.
Yeah,
so
that's great.
Kind of like my takeaway. Yeah.
I knew Ramadan was coming up. I think you'll like this. My son told me, actually, because a friend at school is a Muslim, and he's like, my friend, he's going to be fasting for like 40 days. This is incredible. He's going to be like giving up all this stuff during the day. And I'm like, is your friend Muslim? He's like, yeah, I can't believe he's doing that. So he's kind of inspired, and what I hope happens when we interact with one another like this, that motivates us for our own faith.
Yeah.
So how about for you, Pastor Harvey? You're gonna have the last word.
Well, I think
our time.
What the pandemic did for me in many ways is it helped me rediscover my calling as a spiritual leader, as somebody who is we talk about pastors being a doctor of the soul. I think it refocused me on that. And I think that the fact that not just our church, but most churches kind of took a hit and a few steps back, and which, anytime you take a hit like that, it also means financially and everything else, and you're laying people off. I mean, the whole nine. But at the end of the day, on the other side of the pandemic, I think that we have in a sense, a purified church, and I know I've been purified through it as well. And so, I really want to make sure that on the other side of this, that I focus in on what the calling actually is to be there as a doctor of the soul, a spiritual leader, to help people on their journey of faith. And that, while that's, kind of the obvious thing that I was always supposed to be doing, I think that, as you do it year after year after year, you kind of lose some perspective on some things. And so, yeah, I think coming out of this, I think that's good. I think with the sifting, also the churches, the people that are there, they really want to be there. It's kind of a different dynamic that is kind of beautiful, actually. The connections seem a little bit deeper. And my hope is that will create an environment that will be healthy and welcoming to people that are on spiritual search, that they can come into a place that is healthy for them, So, yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Thank you guys for being guests at the Kaptains table.
Yes.
And what I love about this is emphasizing more about what we have in common. And I've learned a lot just by listening to you guys. So thank you so much. For those of us who are listening, believe it or not, this is my first podcast. This is my first time doing it. So if there are a comment section or whatever with anything you see and you want to give me some constructive criticism, some feedback.
You seem like a pro to me.
Yeah, I know, totally. But hopefully you guys can send me lots and lots of love and encouragement. And I hope, guys, that you guys come back on again sometime. Yeah. And it's been great just hearing from you. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
Okay.
Yes,
everyone else out there, please tune in to the next episode of the Kaptains Table. All right. Thank you so much. See you then.